Hello, everybody. My name is Alexandra Vacru. I'm the Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. And it's a pleasure for me to be hosting a conversation that is hosted in part under the auspices of the Working Group on the Future of U.S.-Russia Relations. It's a working group that we've been running from the Davis Center at Harvard and the Higher School of Economics Research University in Moscow for over 10 years. And one of the results of that was a survey that we did of US and Russian public opinion regarding each other. So we have the authors of the survey with us today to discuss the results. We're very excited about that. And I will introduce them, let you know how the conversation is going to be structured, and then we'll let them take it away. Professor Henry Hale is a professor of political science and international affairs and co-director of the program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia, also known as PONAR's Eurasia. He spent a lot of time conducting field research in post-Soviet Eurasia, and in fact joins us from Moscow today. He has his latest single author book is Patronal Politics, Eurasian Regime Dynamics in Comparative Perspective. Dr. Olga Kamenchuk is an associate research professor at Northwestern University Institute for Policy Research. She is the co-PI on the Comparative National Elections Project for Russian, Ukrainian, and Serbian electoral studies. Dr. Kamenchuk is also currently advising the Russian Public Opinion Research Center, known as VITSIOM, the largest research and polling organization in the former Soviet Union region. The conversation today is going to follow the structure of the working paper pretty closely. If you want to get the paper, it will be uploaded to the website of the working group, which is us-russiafuture.org. And Olga is going to lead off. She's going to introduce the survey and the data and cover the first three parts of the finding. So that's on sources of information, levels of knowledge about each other, and on the nature of mutual perceptions. And then she'll pass the baton to Henry, who is going to talk about how people think the other country is treating their country, how they think that we or they should be treating us or them, and the effects of the Cold War framing before summarizing the conclusions. Throughout, we will be happy to be taking questions. You can please enter them in the chat function, and then we will get them to the authors. So with no further delay, Olga, please.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I'm going to share my screen right now to be able to show you some of the, interesting. Why?
Let me just make sure that you are a co-host.
Oh yeah, okay, now I see. Okay, now I can do that. Good. Yeah. Okay, good. I think it's there for everybody, right?
Yep.
We are currently in United States and in Russia at pretty low point of our relations between the two countries. Some of the big problems that seem to create this misunderstanding and disunity and this negativity in relationship between the two countries stem from events that happened several years ago, misunderstanding on Crimean issue, sanctions, and then countersanctions, and recent accusations on electoral meddling in the course of the previous presidential elections in the United States. So we are at a pretty low point. However, we suggest that there is a possibility to see for potential maybe cooperation or improvement of mutual relations. It's always better to be in some form of peace than in the state of war. At the same time, we also would like to emphasize that public opinion is something which influences policy decisions and international foreign policy, including even in a non-democratic context. Thus, this can also explain why various governments in various countries go in such lengths to and spend so much money to shape the opinion of their audiences in their countries, regardless whether those are democratic, non-democratic, and so on. For this reason, we decided to pay special attention to study of public opinion in two countries, in Russia and in the United States. We used comparative methodology. Here you can see the slide with some major information on this methodology. We used nationwide representative samples in both United States and Russia, collected data from 1,600 people on the same day, actually same 3 days in both countries, in Russia and in United States. In Russia, we used telephone method of data collection, and in the United States, this was an online method. The data that we received was comparative on gender and age, and the margin of error didn't exceed 3%, actually was less than 3%. In Russia, the data was collected by VCOM, Russian Public Opinion Research Center, and it was named at the beginning of this introduction, one of the leading companies in Russia, and in the United States, again, one of the leaders in the industry, YouGov America. So this is the source of our discussion, of our research. First of all, I would like to touch upon interest level and the level of awareness of public about each other, whether there is interest at all and what kind of interest is there. It seems to be there is a pretty high interest in the world affairs in general, both in the United States and in Russia. Over 80% of respondents in both countries say they are interested in what is happening in the world. In the United States, 85%, in Russia, 81%. We did notice a certain, tendency that usually men seem to be a bit more involved in that sphere than women, and people of older generations seem to be more involved and interested in the world affairs compared to the younger generation. But in general, this demonstrates as pretty high interest in world affairs. We also kind of tried to assess the sources of knowledge for, people are interested, but where do they get their news or their information about each other? The major source of world news in both countries is TV, although there is some difference between the United States and Russia. In Russia, that would be over 50%, 56%, and in the United States, almost 39% that say that TV is the major source of world affairs news. I want to emphasize, though, that there is some difference, generational difference between, in the populations. In both countries, younger populations seem to be more involved in new media, social media in the United States, and internet websites in the Russian case. But, reading news, listening to the news is not enough. There are some studies which demonstrate that, personal involvement, quite some studies, personal involvement and personal experience makes better knowledge and different attitude towards each other. Looks like only 12% of Russians know or have some kind of friends or relatives in United States, and only 2% of Americans in Russia. Usually among Russians, those are young people, and in the United States, those are people with postgraduate degrees. I mean, 2% is so little. Both don't talk much about politics when it gets to communication with each other. But again, when they do, it looks like those are younger people in Russia who mostly talk about politics, and those are highly educated people in the United States who do so. And in general, when we ask about what people know about each other, and we made a little test. It wasn't like a full comprehensive test about each other, but a small test, what they know. Well, naturally, both know that Putin and Trump are presidents of both countries. But when we try to dig a little deeper, that's when it's a little limited. Not so many people know who is the head of the International Affairs Office, Ministry, or State Department in both countries. And also, not so many people know, especially in the United States, what is the official policy of the United States towards Crimea. There is an interesting explanation for that we thought about. Maybe one reason it's not as much covered in the United States than in Russia, and then the other reason, well, kind of a position of the president, current American president, is a little different to the position of some other politicians, including some congressional Republicans, and this might confuse some of the respondents. Interestingly, besides some level of interest towards each other, people in both countries think that there is some similarities with regards to American and Russian civilization, so to say, whether we have more in common or not so much in common. Yes, 59% of Americans say that US is a distinct civilization, but yet 41, and that's a lot, think that we have more in common with each other than different. And that's a lot of people. And among Russians, even more Russians think that actually we are not that different from Americans than, being very, very much unique, which is a very interesting discussion, could be discussion by itself in terms of values and perceived values and proximity to civilization. When we discuss the level of commonality between each other and go a little dig a little deeper with that regard, in the United States, Americans see in general more commonality towards each other than in Russia. But at the same time, when we are trying to measure the level of positivity and negativity, the results are also quite different. For example, when we talk about similarity, about 2/3 of Americans think we are kind of more similar, 58%. You can see here the green kind of arrow. And then only 31% of Russians think we are more similar than we are different. And the problem is that there is still, even though there is some understanding of similarity, certain level of understanding of similarity, there's still quite some Americans and actually Russians who have negative attitudes towards each other. There is a difference though. About 2/3, actually more than 2/3 of Americans, 69% of Americans say they have unfavorable, very unfavorable or somewhat unfavorable attitudes towards Russians. This is the orange line here, 42 and 27. And 39% of Russians say that they have negative attitudes, unfavorable or very unfavorable or somewhat unfavorable attitudes towards Americans, less than Americans, but still quite some. When at the same time, when we ask our respondents to evaluate whether the president of that other country fits well with the, goals of the politics or values of that other country, it seems that both Americans and Russians don't think that Putin or Trump don't fit each other's nation. That's especially in the Russian case. At the very end, when this is the end of my part of the presentation, and Henry will take up here, I want to emphasize that even though there is definite level, high level of interest in world affairs, there's not much knowledge about each other. I mean, it's kind of broad, but not very deep, right? There's some understanding, some basic understanding, but not that much. At the same time, there is a definite perception of mutual threat between each other from both American and Russian side. And now I yield the floor to my colleague, to Henry Hale, and he will continue from here.
Okay, thank you, Olga. Let me get my screen up. Okay. So just to basically pick up where Olga left off, one of the interesting things about the favorability questions, about how people generally view the other country, at least one of the things that struck me was that Russians tended to, when we just asked them in their own words, based on American actions and behaviors, things like kind of arrogance or, the attempts by the country to impose its will on other countries abroad. Whereas for Americans, a lot of the negativity had to do with Russia's regime in particular, and policies that it implemented, and Putin personally, just a lot of dislike for Putin personally. And I think that kind of, these attitudes kind of start to shade into the next cut that we wanted to get at this with, which is, okay, so what kinds of things are at the root of the tensions between the US and Russia at the mass level, right? Not thinking about what policymakers think or believe, but what do people perceive it as? And perhaps one of the least surprising findings is that most agree that the other side is a threat. But it's still interesting to drill into this a little bit and then to see what people conclude from that, which is where some surprising findings, in my view, tend to come out. So one of the questions we asked about was just how do you generally assess the current state of US-Russian relations? So as you can see here from this slide, large majorities see things in kind of a negative light, right? So majorities see relations as tense or chilly or hostile. So that seems pretty obvious. We're not in a good state right now, as Olga mentioned. And accordingly, when each side is asked, how is the other country treating our country, right? Majorities also think that the other country is treating their own country badly. So as you can see here, the blue bars represent Russia. So 37% of Russians think that the US is treating Russia as an enemy. 41% think that the US is treating Russia as a rival. And similarly in the United States, in the orange bars, 27% think that the US is treating, or think that Russia is treating the United States as an enemy. 46% think Russia is treating the US as a rival. Very few in either country think that they are being treated really as an ally or as a friend, right? And in the US, it's interesting, there is a partisan divide here. Significantly more Democrats wind up on the side of seeing Russia as hostile and kind of rivalrous, whereas Republicans are a little more likely to think that Russia is more of an ally or a friend in how Russia is relating to the United States. And so this partisan dimension also comes in at different times. So we also wanted to look at a couple specific issues. So we thought that we would share some of the findings on cyber threats, which are very much in the news today. And here too, we can find that populations on both sides see a cyber threat from the other as a very serious threat. So the red bars here represent people who are categorizing the given threat as the very most serious category. Whereas kind of the one next to it, the little lighter green, is people who see it as somewhat serious. So still serious, but only somewhat. But as you can see, whether it is about provoking unrest in the other country, hacking into, the risk of the other country hacking into our own country's infrastructure, vital infrastructure, disinformation campaigns being launched by the other country against our own country, in particular with domestic affairs in mind, and also the hacking of voting. We asked about those in each country, and pluralities, big pluralities identify these as very serious threats, and large majorities see them all as like very serious, at least serious threats, right? Somewhat serious at least. So the cyber realm is also a source of significant tensions. So the question after that, though, is, okay, well, what do people draw from this? I mean, oftentimes analyses tend to stop at this mutual threat perception and to say, okay, well, relations are irreparable or in such a deep state that we're not going to have any hope of, doing anything that could possibly turn things around. But as it turns out, we see a good amount of support for, at least potential support for rejecting the worst forms of kind of tit for tat. At the same time that, there is support for tit for tat for certain kinds of policies. So one thing that we didn't include a slide for, just there are too many, there's too much information in the working report to try to boil down for this. But, one of the interesting findings that we did have was that there was very little support for balance of power diplomacy. So both Russians and Americans were, on the whole, okay with the other country having a strong role in either Mexico or Ukraine, depending on what Mexicans or Ukrainians wanted, for example. Majorities also were generally against things like retaliating against cyber hacking with our own cyber hacking or disinformation campaigns. But at the same time, when you get down to specific, the big flashpoint issues, there still remains a lot of disagreement when you get down to the details. So 3 of these big flashpoints we looked at here were whether or not, were basically Crimea. So the top bar on each side looks at kind of the degree to which the people in a given country, like so in the United States, the top left bar looks at like the patterns of support for the U.S. policy of not recognizing Crimea as Russian. And so we see significant, Americans don't want to back down on that, although there are a good amount of people who are ignorant on that question. There's strong support in the United States for sanctions. The kind of green bars generally indicate support. There's even a good degree of support for expelling diplomats. There were large numbers of diplomats have been expelled, in the last year or two over different crises. And we see broadly similar patterns in Russia, right? Support for countersanctions, support for expelling diplomats, although not huge amounts of support for the diplomats, but of course, overwhelming support in Russia for keeping Crimea as a big potential flashpoint for relations. At the same time, I think one of the interesting findings is that while, if you ask people, okay, not how the other country is treating you, but how should our country treat the other country kind of in response, there's still a good amount of support for, more or less hostile policies, right? Like the orange bars here are United States, and so that indicates that 65% of Americans support treating Russia as an enemy or as a rival. And in Russia, the blue bars show that like 4% think that Russia should treat the United States as an enemy, 35% as a rival. Now these are still significant numbers, but a couple things stand out. I think one is that these are smaller numbers than think that the other country is treating them in the same way. So overall, there is a tendency for people to be less supportive of kind of this tit for tat idea. We should treat the other country like it's treating us. More people would rather treat the other side a little more softly in the hopes of improving relations. And this tendency seems to be strongest in Russia, right? As you can see, in fact, there's a net majority in support of treating the United States as an ally or as a friend. And in the United States, again, here is another question where we see a large partisan divide, where Republicans are much more likely in the United States to be among the people who support treating Russia more as an ally or as a friend, whereas Democrats have a much more, at least the attitude is supporting much more kind of hostile policies in response. So we wanted to drill down a little bit more into this and think about, okay, well, what kinds of compromises might people support? And if we just frame it as a compromise, would they support compromise with Russia? Or in Russia, would they support compromise with the United States? The most general finding is that there is broad agreement, majorities in each country, that would support compromise in principle, right? Meaning, kind of give some ground to the other country for the sake of improving mutual relations. At the same time, and that's what this chart shows, I won't get into it for time considerations, but we can come back to it if you like. But at the same time, again, if you come back to the big issues, like say we in this case, we asked Americans whether the US should consider lifting economic sanctions on Russia in order to restore good relations with it. And in Russia, we asked whether people agreed that Russia should consider ending its support for rebels in eastern Ukraine for the sake of improving good relations with the United States. There's generally opposition to this possibility. So as you can see, majorities in either country, kind of the right-hand bars, sidebars, tend to disagree or fully disagree with the proposition of compromise on Ukraine. And so this is one of the thorny issues, right? There's broad support for doing something to improve relations, but once you start talking about specifics, it starts looking more and more difficult. So in this context, we had actually a lot of, we paid a lot of attention in the survey to the possibility of these opinions being like manipulable or shapeable by leaders, by media. And we find that this is the case, that these opinions are not hard-baked. And I think that probably is rooted in some of the things that Olga was talking about earlier, which is the kind of thin nature of people's both knowledge and sources of information on these issues. So we chose here in the working paper to focus on one particular issue, just because there's a debate in public media about whether or not we're in a new Cold War. So our question was, what does it mean to talk about a new Cold War? And by what does it mean, we're not talking about like kind of, well, from a historical perspective, is it the same thing? But by talking about a Cold War, a new Cold War, raising these images of the Cold War period, is this by itself shaping public opinion somehow in a hostile direction? Well, that's one possibility, right? Is that maybe evoking hostile imagery of the Cold War is making people more likely to imitate Cold War policies, right? Containment, resisting the influence of the other country, global competition. On the other hand, it might be the case that, well, there was a lot of cooperation during the Cold War, despite the differences that we have. So maybe if we talk in terms of a Cold War, maybe it will evoke these kinds of more conciliatory attitudes. The idea that, well, there's big differences, we're not going to solve them, but we should at least work together and get a lot done, like was done in the Cold War with arms control, détente, and a number of other things before the Cold War ended. And here, our finding is that, kind of as is reflected in the title, that basically this imagery is tends to promote more hostile attitudes, at least in the United States, not so much in Russia. And the way we got at this was we asked a couple of questions about whether, we asked directly people, okay, do you support containment? Then another question was, do you support cooperation in the face of differences? But right before asking people these questions, we randomly divided the sample. So we get two groups in the sample of people we interviewed that are basically different only because of random selection, right? They're equal in basically all the sociodemographic parameters. And one half just got a straight up preamble with relations between the United States and Russia in their current state. Do you support containment? Do you support cooperation in the face of difference? But the other half that's randomly selected got a additional wording, which was with relations between the United States and Russia in their current state of a new Cold War, do you support containment or cooperation? So the question is, could even this very small Cold War reminder change the way that people answer the questions? And it turns out that it does in the United States. And in particular, as you can see here, it generates, even this small change in wording generates a 5% rise in the percent of American respondents who agree with the proposition that the US should contain Russian influence around the world using all means available, and a concomitant decrease in the numbers disagreeing with that statement. In Russia, it really doesn't make any significant difference. So this may have to do with kind of different ways in which the Cold War is remembered. And we don't find any effect, however, on support for compromising despite differences. So our argument is not that kind of Cold War framing is kind of universally promoting hostile approaches, but at least in this case, we thought it interesting and worth reporting that at least in the case of the United States, the Cold War imagery does tend to evoke more hostility. So just to wrap up, and then we look forward to your questions, comments, and to a broader discussion. Kind of what we find is there's broad interest in international affairs and in the other country, but knowledge is very thin, and people have very few direct sources of information to kind of fall back on, to kind of make up for what they read in their own country's media. Or hear from their political leaders that they trust. There are large shares in each country, not necessarily majorities, but significant portions that see more commonality than difference. So this is not a case of kind of like a sharp divide that could be called kind of a deep cultural divide. And in fact, especially in Russia, there's even kind of more positivity. And in the US, there's kind of partisan-driven negativity, although it's not entirely partisan. I mean, there's a substantial number of Republicans as well. And a lot of this seems to be rooted in fear and distrust on both sides. And the distrust seems particularly concentrated, or particularly high in the United States, particularly among Democrats, which obviously seems to be linked a lot to what happened in the previous election and what's happened since then, with all the scandals related to Russian intervention. There's, in general, a desire to treat the other better than they treat you. And there's a general support for compromise. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, there's not support for compromise on the thorniest issues. So, we figure probably people don't want to compromise on their own principles, but want the other side to compromise. And so this does seem to be a big sticking point. At the same time, opinion does seem to be manipulable. We're not talking about kind of hard-baked differences, as the Cold War example shows. So kind of our broader point is, yes, there's a lot of hostility, and history has shown that hostility can find support, but there's also the potential for leaders to find support by improving relations with each country if they can find a way to do it, without sacrificing, the actual core principles with which they in which they believe. So let's just leave it there for now, and we look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Henry and Olga. I'd like to step back for a second and ask you why you set out to do this research. What were you looking for, and what is it that you hadn't found in the other research that was out there? There's a lot of surveys, obviously, on both sides, but there's something unique about asking people the same questions in two different countries. And what were you hoping to find? Henry, let me start with you, and then maybe Olga can add.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that one of the important factors that we think shapes policy in both countries, including foreign policy, is public opinion. In domestic politics, there's a lot more research on public opinion, but there have not really been that many systematic attempts to study public opinion on foreign policy and on mutual relations, in the other country. And so, we actually been playing with this idea for a really long time. And since that time, the Levada Center Chicago Council studies, have come out, which have done, some similar things. But our idea was to really try and, get at the extent to which public opinion can be a driver or a brake on hostile relations, and the extent to which public opinion might be manipulable, by either side, right? By leaders on each side to try and gin up support one way or other, whether this is by hostile or cooperative, foreign policy stances. So we wanted to kind of assess the state of mutual relations and, kind of get this insight into what leaders might be responding to in terms of public opinion. But also get a sense of kind of the extent to which this might actually be, manipulable. And our feeling is public opinion is manipulable, but not infinitely manipulable, right? So it does provide some moving force there. And I guess the last thing I'd just say real quick is that, I think there really, there have been more studies on Russia about the United States than in the United States about Russia. More than just, the US usually is just like a couple questions here and there. So we really wanted to use this chance to get into some depth.
And Olga, you ask lots of people lots of questions in surveys. What's special about this one?
Yes, there is several things. On one point, yes, I have participated in numerous studies when we would measure attitude of Russians towards Americans. I participated in some comparative research on perception of own political system in the United States and in Russia, for example, but not so much attitudes towards each other. What I found very interesting in this study, not only we tried to assess mutual perception from both sides, not only what Russians think about Americans, what I did before so much, but also we looked a bit more and deeper into causation and conducted a series of experiments which were, I think, and gave us quite interesting findings, which we're starting slowly to publish, and we will be working on that more. We analyzed manipulability, elites, and media factor, which is very interesting interesting from my perspective here, and this experimental approach and a series of experiments is one of the especially good things that came out of this study. I think it would be nice to continue these studies in the future as well, as we get a bit more challenges as time passes by, and more problems probably will be awaiting us in the future. So that's something which I think we would be interested in continuing as well.
Now, I want to come back to the question of causality that you hinted at, Henry, which is, is it that policy affects public opinion, or does public opinion affect policy? And your finding is it goes both ways, basically. But I was wondering if the way that the sources of information are different in the different countries, if that's playing into the extent to which public opinion can potentially be manipulated by the state. So for example, one of the findings that you have in the beginning of the paper is that most Russians are getting their news from television or news sites, and a lot of Americans are using social media. Is the fact that there might be more diverse base or sources of information on the US side make it more difficult to manipulate public opinion, or does that just not matter? Oh, Henry seems to be slightly frozen, so let me go to you first.
Oh, I think Henry's back.
Okay, sorry, Henry, we lost the beginning of what you said.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think the extent to which people depend on one particular source of information, basically makes it just more dependent on what that source is saying, right? So in the case of Russia, heavy dependence on television, except for youth. And so since television is heavily controlled in Russia, it gives that medium, and whatever's broadcast there, large sway. But I think what that means is then, however, if the Kremlin, for whatever reason, decided to kind of turn the switch, it could also generate opinion considerably, pushing it in the other direction, kind of a more positive direction, if you want to put it that way. Whereas in the United States, I think it's a little more complicated. In the sense that, yes, people have diverse sources of information, and we find in particular youth are relying on social media. But as we know about social media, people tend to be very dependent on sources that tend to reinforce their own points of view. So even though there's diversity, people don't always access diverse points of view. And so that also can have a constraining effect on public opinion that makes it harder to change. But at the same time, if the opinion leaders that they're looking to on foreign policy issues change their tune a little bit and kind of point in one direction or other, I think that this can move public opinion, at least to some degree. And so I think we see this, like, for example, with Republicans in Russia, right? We've seen kind of opinion move under Trump a little more steadily in a pro-Russian, if you want to put it that way, direction. And so it hasn't pulled everyone in that direction, but at least you now see significant differences where you didn't used to see them before. So maybe I'll stop there and let Olga.
Yeah, I would like to add one.
This is one of her.
Yeah, I would like to add one more thing here. There is a significant difference in media trust levels in the United States and in Russia. American media field is much wider, or I would say diverse, right? You can find pretty much anything there, much easier, more accessible. But the trust levels towards media from, when we do comparative studies of that kind in Russia and United States are lower in the United States than in Russia. In Russia, Russians might criticize journalists and some media, but in general, they tend to trust the social institution, and they trust the social institution higher, yet it's less diverse. So that also impacts the perception of information that you get from this source, right? If you exclude the personal sources, and which are not very popular in either way, or are not as much spread, right, in the United States or in Russia. So that's a very important factor. And motivated reasoning, but motivated reasoning plays its role everywhere, both in the United States and in Russia, I think, from that perspective. So that's something to take into account.
Olga, I wanted to follow up on one of the things that that came up at the beginning of the report, which is this discussion of whether the US and Russia are the same civilization or distinct civilizations, right? It's a particularly interesting question, I think, because Americans don't really think in terms of civilizations, but the Russian discussion of where does Russia belong is very kind of civilization heavy. And I was surprised that given how much emphasis is being played on the unique Russian civilization for religious, art, cultural reasons, that despite all of that very strong official narrative in Russia, you still had about 50-50 split among Russians who think it is a distinct civilization, and those who think, let's call it European, right? European American is the same civilization. What do you make of that?
This is a very interesting topic, and the clash of two major value preferences in the country, I mean in Russia, dates back to 19th century, the clash of Slavophiles and Westerners, Западники, славянофилы. So that's the same thing that we are in a way see nowadays, and at certain point one clan, so to say, or one field, one branch takes over the other. So that's why for me, when I was, besides some other things, when I saw this data, it was very interesting. I thought Russians would see at this point of time, with this media coverage, at these points of tensions, I thought more Russians thought that Russia is distinctive and not as much over a common, value area with the United States, but yet it showed it differently. In 2016, I conducted another comparative study, but one part of it was actually Western civilization in general. And that way we also found that Russians see themselves, quite enough Russians see themselves as being part of the Western civilization. Depends where, in which questions. But United States, even though it is part of this Euro-Atlantic civilization or world, it's sometimes distinguished by Russians. There is Europe, and we are in some parts we are Europe as well, and there is America. It's like another planet in some way. So this was another surprising thing for me. But that's a very Russian thing. This centuries-old clash of Slavophiles and Westerners.
And have you had the occasion to present the results to a Russian elite audience? How do they react to this kind of result, for example, that goes against what one might expect?
We had a presentation in December at the working group, and then there was a presentation in Moscow. If we're speaking about Russians and Russian audiences, we presented at the conference of High School of Economics, but it was mostly experts and researchers, and they think in different categories other than political elites. Maybe that's good, but this was not the major focus. We talked mostly about experimental parts and manipulability in that presentation.
Well, this is actually a question from the audience. Henry, let me ask you. We have the question is whether you would get the same kind of results if you ask the questions to the elites as opposed to a random sample of the population. Do you have any feeling about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess I haven't done that particular analysis, but I would say, I would direct people's attention to the survey of Russian elites, which is conducted by Sharon Rivera and Bill Zimmerman. Which you can find, I think you can find online, or at least it'll be, certainly past studies you can find online, or I think there's a 2020 version that will be released very soon. But I think kind of one conclusion, if I can generalize, is that, I think views are not like wildly different between elites and masses. In some types of questions, I think there are, but, I think there is a good deal of similarity, but it depends on the category of elite that one is looking at. So I hesitate to say more to that right off the top of my head because I haven't really looked at the numbers. But from what I've seen from the more recent survey of Russian elites results, I think that there's a good deal of similarity and considerable identification, for example, among elites with European civilization, or identifying Russia with European civilization.
So I want to turn to Crimea, the Crimean questions, which I found particularly interesting, right? So you have you break down the knowledge about U.S. policy towards Crimea and Ukraine, and how much do Americans know about it, and how much do Russians know about it? And not surprisingly, maybe Russians know a lot about it, and Americans don't know so much. But what you find is that 74% of the Russian respondents agree with the Krim nash, Crimea is ours. point of view, and 34% of Americans really don't know anything about it. And what's interesting about that is, since 2014, when Crimea was annexed, so much has happened in terms of the US-Russia relations. So many other developments, be it sanctions, be it the 2016 elections and the meddling, different coronavirus issues that affect everyone right now. And yet in the perception of Russian foreign policy, Crimea is still essential. It's not kind of the center of foreign policy, but it's sort of one of the foundations, that it's basically not up for negotiation. And I wonder if from the result of the surveys, you would say, people are not really that interested in this topic. And the Russians are not going to move on in a way, and the Americans don't care. So does this open up the possibility to have some kind of discussions about Crimea, because it's a high stake issue for one side and a low stakes issue for the other side? I guess either of you, I could ask either of you. Olga, why don't I ask you, since you're not muted?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that Russia considers Crimea being its own part. So given that we're talking about, a territory which Russia considers to be its part, of course, for Russia, it matters a bit more than for America. If we talked about, I don't know, Alaska or some part which doesn't belong to the United States right now, but could belong, probably Americans would care for it a bit more too. It would have been considered to them a domestic issue in one way or the other. Secondly, lots of trouble followed the events of 2014, trouble for Russia. Sanctions and counter-sanctions, Russia being expelled from G7, although it wasn't a big drama in the media, but yet there is lots of coverage. And lots of coverage was dedicated to Crimea, and still is dedicated to this part of the country or part of the world, however you see it. So for Russians, of course, it is a very important issue. It caused some pain. It's, from their perspective, it's a part of their country, a domestic issue, and domestic issues always attract more attention than anything else. So from that perspective, that's, of course, Russians know what's happening there. They might not know that much about differences in perception in the United States towards Crimea, because there's some disambiguity. First of all, not many Americans know about this problem. I mean, quite some don't know or don't remember. And then some are confused, because again, we published a small piece in the Washington Post about that, and that's, I think, cited in the report on this issue, that position of congressional Republicans versus position of Donald Trump goes sometimes differently with that regard, and that also affects the attitudes of Republicans. That's one reason why we see some differences in perception of Putin or Russia with regards to Republicans versus Democrats. And that reflects on Crimea as well, and what Americans think of Crimea as well. Crimea is an important point here, not as much as for Russians. I don't see Russians giving away the idea about Crimea in any near future, but Americans seem to be stronger, insisting on sanctions, on Crimean being annexed rather than added or reintegrated, that seems to be a problem for the future. Eastern Ukraine or the Donbass area seems to have a bit less attachment from the Russian audience, but still quite some Russians support insurgents there from the polls.
Henry, can you tell from the survey, people might not know much about Crimea, but they support sanctions, right? Is there an understanding that those things are related, or does it just not necessarily matter to the American audience, maybe because of the Cold War framing?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is Crimea is one of those issues in the United States where it's not salient, right? It's in the sense that it's not being brought up every day, but when it is brought up and mobilized by elites, and this is a case where probably there's a lot more elite attention to this issue than there is the masses, that it generates strong negative feelings. And so, my guess is that it's very unlikely that American elites, even a lot of Republican ones, are going to support any kind of recognition of Crimea as part of Russia. And therefore, my guess is that it's going to be very hard for American publics to accept that, given the possibility that the American politicians, at least a good number from both parties, will be likely to mobilize to support it. At the same time, I think the much more salient issue in American politics regarding Russia is, of course, election hacking, cyber threats, things like that. And those are things that we didn't ask about levels of knowledge about that, but given the strong partisan breakdowns of a lot of the support patterns regarding Russia, I'd be very surprised if there weren't pretty high awareness of that issue, right? Of knowledge of at least the charges, if not the details, of Russian cyber threats and hacking the election, the potentially trying to interfere, discredit democracy, those kinds of things. So I think those probably also feed in more powerfully on their own right, into the the negative perceptions that the U.S. has, American populations have regarding Russia. And so again, take any of those out. Maybe you could have some things, but you could have some changes in relations. But those are two big sticking points. And one problem with cyber hacking is just it's very hard to credibly commit not to do it. Right, because by its nature, it's covert, right? You can sign a treaty, okay, we're not going to interfere in your affairs, but it's very hard to do it. So you get into this realm of what international relations scholars would call a security dilemma, where both sides feel vulnerable to the other side's hacking, and at the same time, they sorry.
And no trust at this point.
Yeah, and no trust, and inability of the other side to commit not to engage in these, at least without some broader basis of trust being out there. And in this general environment, it seems very difficult. So I think there's a desire to trust the other side and a desire to have better relations, but just under the current circumstances, it just seems very difficult. And I think initiatives are going to have to come from elites on at least one of the sides.
And I want to emphasize one thing, in this case, election meddling is something domestic for Americans, and Crimea is something domestic politics for Russians. So in that regards, there is much more involvement of one audience with its domestic, area of, events, and then the same goes with the other one. So Russians are more into what is going on around Crimea, as they see it as a domestic affair, and then Americans are much more concerned, or at least heard something about election meddling potential or possible of Russians in the United States.
Yeah. And I guess just one, sorry.
One of the things that I found extremely interesting is that Russians are actually also worried about cyber attacks that provoke unrest or disinformation or hacking voting systems. I didn't expect that. In fact, the fear of the other is almost the same on both sides.
Well, yes, especially I want to remind that the word disinformatia and disinformation are where it stems from, and how they are connected. It's a very well-known term in Russia, in post-Soviet countries, in post-Soviet context in general, and very familiar. Just as Americans of older age groups know much or heard much or have a little bit of references on Cold War, right? And we saw some differences and generational differences with regards to how we perceive Cold War or containment and so on in the United States. The same goes about disinformation in Russia. There is fear, there was always certain suspicion with that regards, with manipulation of information by Americans with regards to Russians as well. It also, to some degree, these things are connected with the fear of social media and so-called colored revolutions, which happen around Russia as well in some countries. And as some Russians, quite some, suspect active role of Americans there, and not wanting this to happen in Russia.
Henry, did you want to add something? You're muted.
Muted.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the issue of kind of foreign interference in Russian voting came up even in the constitutional voting in Russia on the constitutional amendments, where you had officials or party members at different points kind of warning about this possibility that maybe one problem with electronic voting would be interference from the other side trying to kind of undermine the credibility of votes like this. So it is something kind of real or not that is promoted. It's an idea that's promoted in Russia, as a threat, and specifically voting, right? So whether or not it's real, it does register in the minds of at least a lot of citizens.
But again, it goes kind of in line with the trust level or towards institutions and institutional distrust in Russia. Post-Soviet and Eastern European citizens tend to have not as much trust in institutions and elections including, regardless whether those are not very democratic or more democratic regimes. And that trust level is an important factor here as well.
So our time is running out, unfortunately, but I wanted to ask each of you to let us know what was the most surprising result for each of you from the data.
Well, as a person who is both Russian and American and has lived for many years in both countries and in EU, I kind of try to see both audiences, Russian audience and American audience. And with all the past problems that there were in our relations between the United States and Russia, at least in the past several years, I was pleasantly surprised that there is a potential for some cooperation. And we have seen that there are areas where we can still move a needle a little bit here and there. There are more hard security, such as, joint fight against terrorism, for example, right? Or nuclear threat, things like that. But there are things where we are able to be supportive or interested in each other. I also enjoyed seeing that there is some similarity in how we see each other in terms of culture. Civilization question, right? What we talked about, and that there is some amount of people who communicate with each other, have relatives or friends, not much, but there is some. So I think the findings were a bit more optimistic, at least from my expectations, than I thought, given the moment when we collected the data. And that's what I found interesting, especially. And second thing, which I really enjoyed from the methodological perspective, is our wonderful experiments, with which we will talk about more, I hope.
Henry?
In addition to what Olga mentioned generally, I think just one concrete finding that did surprise me was the degree to which people in both countries rejected sphere influence politics, right? So, even in Russia on the whole, right, if we're willing to agree with the idea that if Ukraine, kind of made a different geopolitical choice, that it should be respected. So I think, part of what that shows is that a lot of people just don't believe it has made that choice, which has to do with a lot of things. And, but similarly in the United States, a surprising number of people to me were okay with the idea of Mexico kind of, aligning itself with Russia, should the Mexican people feel that way. And so that was surprising, given the prevalence of kind of sphere of influence thinking in both countries. And so, I think, there are a lot of interesting kind of surprising things here, but that was one that was, I think kind of quite unexpected for me.
Wonderful. Well, I believe that we have now posted a link to the report in the chat box for people who want it. It's also available on the website for the Working Group on the Future of U.S.-Russia Relations, which is us-russiafuture.org. And it's been a pleasure to have this conversation with Olga Kamenchuk from Northwestern and Henry Hale from George Washington University. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the Carnegie Corporation for supporting both the Working Group and this survey.
Thank you very much, Alexander. It was very nice to talk with you, and I was very glad to see Henry again, even though it's so far away now.
We'll do it again.
Yes, thanks to everyone, and look forward to discussions to follow.